Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So today I'm going to show off the PowKiddy RGB20. Now this is my first time using a PowKiddy device myself, so in addition to doing a review, I'm also going to do a quick unboxing and setup guide for you as well. So let's talk about what this device is. Number one, it uses a Rockchip 3326 chipset, which is the same thing that's used in the Anbernic RG351P, the RK2020, the Odroid Go Advanced, the RGB10. So there's a lot of devices that already have this chipset, and it runs almost identically to all of those Odroid Go Advanced clones. And it has a 3000 milliamp hour battery, which is a little bit smaller than the RG351P, which has a 3500 milliamp hour battery. So they say it's supposed to get about 5 to 6 hours of gameplay in this device. I haven't had enough time to really test that out, but that seems about accurate. So some other features with this device is that it has a Wi-Fi chip and it actually works, which is awesome. And it's an Odroid Go Advanced clone, like I already mentioned before, so it has the ability to use any of the operating systems that work with that device. And it prices out at about $80 to $90. During Black Friday and Cyber Monday, it was down to $80, but I think it retails for $90. Alright, so let's do a quick unboxing. So it came in this big box like this. I actually got it from RetroMimi.com. They sent me this review copy, so if you want to check out their store, I have a link down below. But open it up and then you can see inside there is just a single box in there. Now the packaging itself is very no frills. There's no writing or anything on it other than on the front here where it just says PowKiddy RGB20. So let's just get into the device. So kind of your typical retro handheld setup. It just has it in a little baggie there, and then underneath you can find a instruction manual. It just has a few instructions on it, and then it comes with a USB-C cord. Now this cable actually was pretty nice, and I tested it out, and it actually runs both power and data, so it's a little bit better than the ones you get from Anbernic. Alright, now for the big reveal. And here we are. So it's kind of a weird look to it, you know, it's got this vertical kind of orientation to it, but it's big, you know, it's not the small size of like the RG280V or anything like that. It's just a little bit bigger. And you know, here I'm testing the buttons out and they actually feel pretty good. Like they were a little bit better than I expected. A little bit of clickiness to the actual like smaller buttons like the start and select and the other power buttons. But the face buttons themselves had a nice mushiness to them. They felt pretty good. One interesting thing is it has speaker holes in the front, so we'll test that later, but it looks like it has a speaker in the front. And then up top you can see it has a headphone jack, a single SD card slot, 2 USB-C ports, and then a Wi-Fi on and off switch, which I thought was kind of interesting. Now the 2 USB ports, the middle one is for charging and the right one is for OTG. On the back you can see it actually has the shoulder buttons inlaid into the device itself. These were actually the least impressive of all the buttons. They just felt kind of cheap and not very well secured in there. So they made small design choices which I like. For example, they covered up the screws with a little bit of plastic there. And I also like the feel of the plastic. It's not quite slick. It has a little bit of grit to it, but it feels okay. Although if I am going to be honest, it does feel like it's kind of like a cheap toy in terms of just the quality of the plastic. On the sides you can see there's not really anything there other than a single power button and a reset button. So a very simple device, you know, and a lot of the controls and everything are just right there on the front, which honestly makes it a little bit busy on the front, but we'll test that out later. So one thing I noticed right off the bat is just how the D-pad feels against the device itself. So it's a little more inset into the device than I'm used to. For example, with the RG351P or any of the RG devices, they typically have buttons and D-pads that stick out a little bit more. This one's a little bit different. When you push on it, it goes kind of flush with the device. And like I mentioned already, you know, these other face buttons, they feel kind of clicky, and you can see they kind of get stuck. You can see with the R3 button there, it just gets stuck every once in a while. And so not the highest quality, you know, but in general, they feel pretty good. I am a little bit worried that some of these are going to break at some point. The fact that they're already getting stuck right out of the box is kind of a bad sign. And that single analog stick, it just feels like a normal analog stick that you would get on any RG device, as well as like on the Nintendo Switch. It's the same size, the same height, all that kind of stuff. So not bad. And it is clickable, so you can click down on it and it's L3, even though there is a dedicated L3 button. Overall, it's not that bad feeling, when you hold it in your hand. Those shoulder buttons definitely need some work though. They don't feel very good to me. But a lot of these retro devices really don't actually require shoulder buttons, it's usually used for like save states and things like that. So in that sense, I'm not too worried about how great the shoulder buttons are. Now, like I mentioned before, the feel of the D-pad and the buttons themselves are a little bit flush, and I don't know how that's going to translate into gameplay. If you look here with the RG280V, you can see that the buttons in the D-pad stick out a lot more than the RGB20. And you can see when I push down on the D-pad, there's still like a millimeter of D-pad sticking out from the device itself. Now watch when I do the same with the RGB20, it basically goes flush with the device. It just goes almost all the way down. And that's a difference where when I'm pushing down, I almost feel like I'm not pushing all the way down, like it's not allowing me to go all the way down. The face buttons aren't quite as bad in the RGB20, but they're still not as prominent as the ones on the RG devices from Anbernic, and because of that, it just has this kind of weird feel like, am I really pushing down all the way? It's this weird balance between sticking out too much and not sticking out enough. So one thing I really don't like about this device is that the shoulder buttons actually have kind of a rattle to them. So you can see me here, I'm shaking the 351P, and then I'm shaking the 280V. There's no rattling or anything like that with any of these devices, but listen to this one. So to me, that's kind of annoying. If it's not annoying to you, no worries, but it's just something I wanted to point out to kind of temper your expectations. Alright, so let's boot it up and see how long it takes. And like I mentioned before, it's running EmuELEC, and you can see it's actually running EmuELEC 3.5, which is pretty outdated. At this point, EmuELEC is at 3.9, and they're knocking on 4.0. So my conclusion there is that they are just using an older version of the firmware. Okay, so it took 18 seconds to boot up. That's just not bad, For comparison's sake, the RG350, which boots very quickly, can do it in about 9 to 10 seconds, and then the Retro Pocket 2 takes almost 40 seconds to boot up. So the interface here is just a typical EmuELEC interface, nothing special here if you've ever used any of these kind of devices. I really do like this interface. I like this operating system. It's just very simple and allows you to navigate right to your system and then to your games. And you can see here in the settings it is EmuELEC 3.5. So let's test out the Wi-Fi. So all you have to do is just go into the network settings and enable Wi-Fi, but you can see here I'm not able to find any networks. So that left me a little confused, and so I thought, well, let me actually try it with an OTG adapter and then a USB Wi-Fi adapter. And so I'm going to plug it into the OTG side. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to search for a Wi-Fi network. And look at that, they all come up. So because we're having these Wi-Fi issues right out of the box, I decided that, probably the best thing to do is to upgrade EmuELEC and put on a more modern version of it and see if that fixes the Wi-Fi problem. For example, if they have new drivers in the newer versions, whatever. So we're going to do that. But before we do that, I am going to connect to my own network, and I'm going to go and I'm going to FTP into this device so I can see what's on that SD card. So here we are on my computer, and I'm using a program called WinSCP, which is an FTP client, and I'll leave all of this information in my written review, which is linked below. But basically, you put in the IP address you're connected to, then the username root, and then the password EmuELEC, and then you connect with that. So once you're connected, you actually have access to everything on the SD card, including the configuration files, but the most important part is that you're able to go and get into where the games are. So you go into the ROMs folder, and you can actually pull up any of these folders and see what games are preloaded on here. And unfortunately, it's preloaded with a lot of junk. And so you could essentially just play this thing out of the box and play the games that are loaded on here. But I wouldn't recommend that. One, because you're basically just playing illegal games. But two, you should be playing copies of the games that you already own, right? You should build your own game library, and this is where you should put everything. So if there's anything in here that you want to grab, then go ahead and go in there. For example, in the BIOS folder, you might find some BIOS, which are system files. But unfortunately, there actually are no BIOS files in this device. So I'm not sure where they're hidden. Either way, I'm not worried about it because I know where they go and I know the names they need to be. And so I'll show you that here later in a second. Okay, so now that we've seen the inside of the SD card, I don't think there's anything we need to keep here. So I'm just going to go and take a new SD card and I'm going to flash EmuELEC 3.9 on here. So I'll have the link below to this site. You just go on here and then you grab the Odroid Go Advanced image. And it's about 500 megs, so just go ahead and download it and then unzip it and put it somewhere. So I'm just going to extract it to my downloads folder, just make it easy on myself. Okay, now we're going to use an app called Win32 Disk Imager. And this is basically going to take that image and it's going to burn it onto my new SD card, and that'll be my new operating system. So very easy. All you have to do is plug in your SD card, find that file, and then hit the right button. Okay, and it just takes a minute and you're done. At this point, you can just take the SD card out of your computer and then put it into your device and boot it up, which is what we're going to do. Okay, so here we are. I have a 128 gig Samsung SD card here, and I'm just going to take out the old SD card and put in this new one, and then I'm going to turn the device on. Okay, so the first time that you actually boot up EmuELEC, it's going to resize the partition to be able to give you the option to use all of the available disk space on your SD card. So you just give it a minute and let it kind of run through and do its thing. All right, so here we are. So this is EmuELEC 3.9. I'm just going to go in here and just double check, make sure everything looks okay. First things first, I want to make sure the network works, so I'm going to go over and I'm going to turn on my Wi-Fi switch, which I had turned on and off just to try to see if that worked. And then look at that, I was able to connect right there to my network. So everything's now working as expected, which is awesome, and so you can go in and check, like the themes updater to verify that it works, and it sure does. So let's do the same thing, let's FTP into this device now. Now I'm going to download a new theme here called NES Box, which is my favorite, and I'll also leave that in my guide below. But basically I'm just going to add this to the themes folder. And the themes folder can be found under Storage, Config, Emulation Station, and then Themes. Okay, so you just drag that over, and then go back to the device, and then go into UI settings, and you'll see it there as an available theme. So all you have to do is select it and then back out, and it'll switch over. And there we go, we're with the NES box. Okay, so let's talk about adding games themselves. So here is the ROMs folder that we're using through FTP still, and then also on top of that, I'm looking at the EmuELEC website, which shows you all the different systems that are supported, which folder they go in, and what kind of file type they need to be. So what is the file extension? Is it going to be an NES file or a zip file, things like that. So this is a good indication of where to start. If you're trying to build your library, these are the kind of games you want to store, and then these are the games you want to move over onto your device as well. Now on top of that, you can actually find the different BIOS requirements. So there's a BIOS page and you can go through and look and say, okay, I want to play Doom 1 and 2. What BIOS files do I need? What system files do I need? I want to play Dreamcast. What are the files I need for that? And you'll be able to go through and see exactly what they need to be named and where they're supposed to be stored. And that's basically it. So you just move over your ROMs into the respective folder on the SD card, and then you also will move over your BIOS files. Now something to bear in mind, the only way you can add new games is through this wireless FTP, which is not the fastest thing in the world. So you get about 2 to 4 megabytes per second. So when you're moving over Game Boy games or NES games, it moves super fast, it's great. But if you're trying to move over an entire PSP library, I would just kind of expect to take an hour or two just to move everything over. And that's just kind of how things are. But luckily it's all wireless and very easy to do. Okay, so now that we're back on the system, we've gone and loaded all the games, you just go into game settings and then you hit update games list. And there you go, there are all the games that I just added to my system. Pretty awesome, huh? So let's start up a game and see how it looks. We're going to go into NES and then start up Batman. Okay, and you can see here it's running RetroArch in the background. Alright, so right off the bat, let's kind of compare how these devices look. So this is the RGB20 using no shaders or scaling or anything else like that, running an NES game in 3x2. And you can see here, it looks okay. It's got a little bit of weird pixelation in the name as well as with the Batman character sprite. But it's the same thing that happens in the RG351P. And I think any of these Odroid Go Advanced devices, which are using this 3x2 display, they're going to have the same issue. So one thing I do want to say about the display is that it's actually very, very high quality. You can see just from the viewing angles just how nice this is. It's a very nice and bright screen. It's actually the same kind of viewing angles and the same brightness that I get from the 351p, which I felt is probably one of the best screens I've ever had. So I just want to say here that this screen is actually really nice on this device, especially for that price. Okay, let me take a second and show you how to improve the screen on this device. Now I have a whole screen configuration guide for the 351p, which actually will work perfectly with this device as well, but let me show you real quick what you need to do. So you go into Online Updater in RetroArch and you do Update Shaders. You select that and then it'll download new shaders for you and then it'll extract that zip file as well. Okay, so once that's done, you go into the quick menu for the game itself and you go into Shaders, you turn on Video Shaders, and then you go to Load Shaders. And in there you'll find that same shaders GLSL file that we just downloaded. And then scroll all the way down till you find Scale NX. And then open up the Scale 2X shader. And that's it. You just can go and exit out of that and go into the game again. And you can see here Batman looks a lot better now. He's more balanced, you know, not so pixelated and weird looking. And look at how sharp and nice that name of Batman looks there. So everything looks good now. So one thing that's a little weird about this device is that in order to increase and decrease volume, you have to hit select and then up and down. It works really nice, but it's just kind of weird. So one thing that kind of struck me as I started playing the game is that the device itself, the controller that you're holding, is actually very small. If you look at where the top of the shoulder buttons are, that's basically your device, right? You just have a screen on top of that. And so as you're holding it, it's a little bit awkward to kind of have this feel where you're only holding the bottom of the device. You could kind of put your fingers up against the sides of the device, but it doesn't feel very balanced. You can see here, if I'm holding my fingers in the middle, it's not something that's kind of balanced in the hand. It's a little bit bottom heavy, which is odd because as you're holding it, it actually feels top heavy because all your fingers are on the bottom. And so it's just kind of this awkward feeling, you know, and I have medium-sized hands, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that it's not the most balanced feeling device in the world. All right, so let's look at gameplay here. And honestly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I've done a lot of videos with the RG351P, which has the exact same chipset. But in general, you can expect to have the same amount of performance with the Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PSP, and the Nintendo DS. And those are the four systems that kind of don't work perfectly on the 351P. And by that same measure, they don't work perfectly on this device. But they're playable for the most part. Really, it just depends on which game it is you want to play and whether or not it runs well. Okay, so one thing I want to show you is how to change the default emulator. So you go into the emulator itself, then you hit select, and then do advanced system options, and then emulator settings, and then you can pick your emulator. And so with MAME, for example, I like to use the MAME 2003 Plus ROM set, which is not the default emulator. So I have to go in there and I have to change the default emulator to the MAME 2003 Plus set. But that's it. After that, it's done. So let's try booting up a couple arcade games and see how they perform. So here's Killer Instinct, which is a game that's very hard to play on any emulator, and you can see here you're getting about 15 frames per second, which is about the same as the RG351P. So currently I consider this to be unplayable, but maybe it's something you want to just try out just to see how it is. Now the Mortal Kombat games, they run really well. You can see here they're running at basically full speed, and just want to make a note here that I still got it. Look at that, killing Scorpion. Anyway, so this one's working just fine. I think there's no issues with MAME. It's just the same performance that I was expecting from the RG351P. Now let's get back to that D-pad and fighting games here. So you can see here I'm playing Marvel vs. Capcom, and I'm having kind of a hard time doing the moves, you know, in it because that D-pad is just a little bit weird. I'll tell you, it's not as hard feeling as the RG351P, but I don't know if it's pushed out enough. I think that it maybe over time is going to get even harder to play as the membrane that it kind of rests on gets a little bit looser over use. And so in that sense, I think that this is maybe not the ideal D-pad for fighting games. And I'm not an expert in fighting games by any means, but I just kind of wanted to show you how it looks. Okay, so here we are. I've switched over to Final Burn Neo at this point, so I'm using here Street Fighter Alpha 3, and it's running pretty good. You know, it's nice and smooth. Everything looks pretty good. It feels nice, but again, that D-pad is not quite ideal for me. It also doesn't help that I accidentally picked Blanca for this. I was meaning to pick Ken, but whatever. Alright, so let's switch over to PSP here. I'm going to use Ridge Racer as my kind of benchmark game here, just because I've used it before, and I can tell you right now that it's running just as well as it did on the RG351P, at its best. So that's kind of a positive sign that the PSP actually runs pretty well here. One odd thing is the select and up and down does not change the volume on this standalone emulator. You actually have to hit that V button, which is down below, which is very awkward, and you hit up and down with that one, and that's how you actually change the volume in these standalone emulators like this. Okay, so moving over to Sega Dreamcast, I'm playing with no frame skip here, and I'm getting about 20 to 25 frames per second with Dead or Alive 2, which is pretty good. It's not quite as good as Retroid Pocket 2, but it's still looking pretty good, and this is with 640 by 480 screen resolution, so it's pushing through the pixels pretty well. Okay, sticking with Dreamcast here, here's Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Now, this game usually runs very smoothly, that's why I like to test with it, but you can see here I'm actually getting a lot of frame dips and a little bit of stuttering and stuff, so not quite perfect on this device itself when it comes to running this particular Dreamcast game. Now, there may be things we can change in the emulator core settings in RetroArch later on, but for now I'm just using the default settings, and it's a little disappointing to see that I am having some speed issues with this device. Okay, now moving over to DS. Now this one was actually very disappointing because I could not figure out how to get into the menu in Drastic. I tried all sorts of different button combinations and whatnot. I couldn't get any of them to work. And you can see here it's showing this kind of two-screen display, which makes everything really tiny on the device. So unfortunately, until I figured that out, I just wasn't happy and I wasn't really able to test the DS at this time. So a couple other neat features with EmuELEC that I want to show off real quick is you have the ability to set the time zone in this. So for example, if you're playing a Pokemon game or an Animal Crossing game where the time zone is important, you can do that in this device. So I have one other feature I want to show you, and this is something I actually made a mistake about with the ArcOS video a couple weeks back, and that's because in ArcOS I was able to figure out that it has its really nice screensaver, but I just now recently learned that EmuELEC also has that same screensaver. So you just go into screensaver settings here under UI settings, and you just change it to say random video. Right now it just goes to black, and I didn't realize that you could change it to random video. And once you change it to random video, you can go and change other things, for example whether or not you want to show the name of the game and things like that. But once you've got that all figured out, you just go ahead and hit B to exit out of it, and it's going to save that from then on. So all you have to do is hit select and then start screensaver. And you can see there, it plays right there. And if you hit start at any time when any of these games are playing, it'll boot that game directly. So that's pretty awesome. Okay, so let's start wrapping things up here. Let's talk about how I feel about the PowKiddy RGB20. First, let's start with the things I like about the device. So to start, I really like that this device is deceptively powerful. It kind of looks a little bit like a kid's toy, but honestly, when you pull it up under the hood, it has that Rockchip 3326, and it can play games even on the PSP and things like that, and I think that's really impressive. I really like the quality of the screen. I think it's very high quality, one of the best I've seen. So the buttons and the D-pad I would rate as being good, and that's probably a 6 or a 7 out of 10. And honestly, that's not the best thing in the world. I do prefer the ones on the Anbernic devices, but it's still miles ahead of the Retroid Pocket 2, which are just kind of clicky and weird. I love that it has a Wi-Fi connection, so this is just something that makes it really cool, because once you have the operating system installed in your SD card, you never have to take the SD card out again, because you can just wirelessly FTP everything back and forth. So you can add new games, you can add new themes, you can scrape your box art right then and there on the device. There's just all these kind of neat things you can do with Wi-Fi. You can enable cheats and play through with cheats, you can have retro achievements. There's a lot of potential with a device that runs Wi-Fi like this. And one of the other nice things about this device is that it rests on the background of the Odroid Go Advanced community, which is a very active community who has lots of different solutions and features. There are many different operating systems you can play on this device. I'm using EmuELEC, but you can use Batocera or different ones like that. And I think that's just a really kind of neat feature of having a device that is running off of the OGA community. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these operating systems are not built for the RGB20. For example, EmuELEC is only for the Odroid Go Advanced. It just so happens that you're able to play them on this device as well. So you don't get any official support in EmuELEC for this device, but luckily it still works. And finally, I think this is a really good price point. You know, $80 on sale or $90 normally, I think that's a really nice place to be. You know, when you're talking about an $80 to $90 device and what it can do, you know, I think this is still a really good value, you know, in terms of just the fact that it can play some of those high-end games, but also play all those low-end games really, really well. It has a very high-quality screen, and it has that Wi-Fi connectivity, which I think is just awesome. And so overall, I definitely think this is worth that price. Now let's talk about the things I actually don't like about this device. So number one, it kind of feels like a toy. I mentioned that kind of in the positives too, but when it comes down to it, it does feel a little bit just kind of plasticky and kind of just cheaply made, unfortunately. And those shoulder buttons are a real big part of that. The fact that they rattle like that, they just don't feel very good. Some of those face buttons kind of stick as well. Overall, I just think the build quality is not so great on this device. Now the whole audio setup on this thing is confusing. It has a front speaker, but it also has two rear speakers. And why do you have rear speakers if you have front speakers? It just doesn't make sense to me. And then changing the volume is very weird because there's a V button, which is a volume button that you can use, but it doesn't work all the time. For example, you need to hit select and up and down when you're in RetroArch. And so it's just very odd and confusing the way that audio is handled on this device. And like I mentioned before, it's a little bit unbalanced in the hand. If you're holding it, it just feels kind of like wobbly, like it's going to fall out or something. That is not something that you feel with the RG350 devices or, like even the 280V. It just doesn't have that same feel to it. So to me, it feels a little bit unbalanced in the hand, and that may not be a deal breaker to you, but it's just something I wanted to point out. And another thing to think about is the fact that this is an $80 to $90 device, which is definitely worth that. I think the value is there. But the fact is that there are other devices out there, there's competition out there that make this kind of an argument, right? Whether or not this is worth $80 to $90 in the face of the fact that there are other devices like the Retroid Pocket 2, which is $80, or even the RG280V, which is $80, and even the Anbernic RG351P, which is $90 to $95. All of those are in that same price range, and each of them have their own benefits over the other. So it's just something to think about, is that despite the fact that this is a good value for the price, there's still some competition out there and you need to shop around. And finally, I just have to say it, this thing is ugly. Like, it is just, it's so weird looking, right? It has that analog stick in the bottom and it's off balance. If it was centered, I might even be able to kind of forgive it a little bit, like a Nintendo 64 or something. But the fact that it's like just a third of the way across is really weird to me. The fact that there's an R3 button on here, but not a right analog stick, it's just kind of odd the way it's all set up, And I showed it to my family. I said, hey, look at this thing. And they've seen the 280V and they love it, right? And they saw this and my wife was like, oh, what's that? Like, like it doesn't capture that nostalgic feel that the way the 280V does. So if it doesn't bother you, no worries. But for me, man, this thing is ugly. Okay, so I did talk about competition already, and this is something that I want to make my last point about, is the fact that this is kind of an in-between device where it doesn't do anything perfectly, right? So for example, the 280V is small and pocketable, right? That's the appeal of this little device, right? Is that you can just throw it in your pocket, and it doesn't matter if it only can play up to PS1, because you can still play those classic games on the go. You throw it in your pocket, you go out in town, you can pull it out while you're waiting in line somewhere, and it's just a fun experience. I don't see that happening with the RGB20. Now, same thing here with the RG351P, right? This has that beautiful craftsmanship to it. It just feels really nice in the hands. It has that dual analog stick setup. Everything just feels natural and comfortable. It has a beautiful volume wheel on the right of it. Everything is just kind of a little bit nicer when it comes to those little tweaks for the RG351P in particular. And RGB20 doesn't quite have that. It doesn't have that same level of craftsmanship, even though it's a very similar price. So something to think about is that it kind of bridges the gap between these two without really displacing either of them. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. I think we're about to hit 5,000 subscribers, so I'm really excited about that, and thanks for watching. I really appreciate that. Until next time, we'll see you later. Happy gaming.